Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to build a multi-step form in React and Next.js. We're going to use React hook forms to manage the state. We're going to use ZOD to validate our fields. And at the end, we're going to add animation to our different steps using framer motion. We're going to end up with something like this. If I hit next, ZOD is going to kick in and validate our fields. And if I now fill in the form here, I am able to now go to the next step. We have a little animation here, and then we can put in an address, a city, a province, and a zip code, and then finish at the complete section or the last step. So let's get into this. So I've started with a brand new Next.js application that's using TypeScript and Tailwind CSS. It's pretty much what you get out of the box. I've only added this pretty RC for some formatting options. I added this plugin for Tailwind, so it just also formats your Tailwind classes. I've also added this Tailwind plugin for forms because we're dealing with forms. I'm using Tailwind components inside. I'll show you for what parts I'm using it. But other than this, it's pretty much what you get out of the box. I've just changed the home page, which is this component that you're seeing, responsible for rendering our form here. I'm rendering my form right inside of my home page. And the layout is basically what you get out of the box when you run the script. So inside of our homepage, all I'm doing is literally rendering this form. So let's go inside of this form. Let me actually close this and close this off. Let's look at our form from a high level and see what we're doing here. So we have this bigger section. There is a navigation part up top that you can see containing our steps. I'm going to come back to this as steps in a second. I have a form component and some conditionally rendered segments or steps actually. And then down in the bottom, I have these two buttons for navigation. These are these two buttons that allows you to go back and forth between different steps. So let's just start from the steps. This is this component that you can see up top that's rendering the current step or how many steps we have in total. For this, I have used Tailwind components. So if you go to Tailwind, they actually have a paid version or UI component library. So if you click on the component, you can see different types of components, different types of sections, pages and whatnot. Down here, they have different types of steps that you can render. I have selected this top one, and all we're doing here really is the rendering a navigation and an unordered list, and for each list element or for each step, we're rendering a button. And we're actually mapping over the steps. So I've created this array of steps outside of my component where I can define my steps. So step one is the personal information. Going back to our page, this is a step one. It has an ID or a title, identifier, and a name. Step two and step three. We're going to add to this array later on by actually also including what fields goes in each step, so we can then trigger a validation using React hook forms and ZOD. But for now, we only have these steps defined. We're mapping over each step, and for each one, we're rendering a list element and a button. So this button allows you to also navigate between different steps. I'm going to disable this later on because actually when you are clicking on these buttons, you have to also validate the form to be able to move to the next step. I want to keep this tutorial pretty simple. So we're going to look at the concept by implementing it inside this next and back or previous buttons. But once you understand the concept, you can actually apply the same concept, same logic to these buttons. I'm going to just disable the buttons. So therefore, the user can only click on these buttons to navigate between different steps of our form. Now, inside of the form, before we jump into the form, one quick note is that for different steps, I'm actually holding a local state called current step, starting from 0. And for each step, we are actually rendering a section inside of our form. So I have this input for the first name here, and then the last name, and then the email. This is our first section. Our next step actually is the address information, where we have the country, the state, the city, the region, zip code, and whatnot. And then the last step is the actual completion, where you've submitted your form doing any asynchronous tasks that you were supposed to do, talking to your API, to your database and whatnot. And then once that succeeds, you bring them back into this third step, or the last step, which is the completion. Now down here for navigation, again, we have these buttons with some SVG components inside that are going to just help us navigate between different steps. So what we're doing is that in one of them, we're calling this previous function, and the other one is calling this next function. So let's see these two functions up top. So this next function is going to look at the current step, and if this is lower than the length of our array of steps -1, meaning that we do have another step, is going to actually set this current step to the next one, or it's going to increment it by 1. And the previous function is going to then decrement the step, but it only does that if we are actually on a step higher than 0. So if we are on the very first step, the user can't actually go back. So with this implementation, we have the shell, the foundation of what we're going to be working on. Right now, we're not validating, we're not actually controlling the states or the values for any of these fields, and the user can navigate between all the steps regardless of whether or not they have put anything here. Now in the next step, let's actually bring in React Hook Forms and actually add some state and validation to each of these steps or each of the fields inside of our steps. Okay, so instead of you watching me code this step by step, I've gone ahead and added React Hook Forms, ZOD, and some resolvers that will help us to validate our form, but I will walk you through exactly what I have done. Now, if you're not familiar with React Hook Forms and ZOD, I do have a video dedicated for that topic where we dive deeper into actually step-by-step implementing React Hook Forms and ZOD in Next.js. So I'm going to include a link in the card somewhere so you can watch that video if you're not comfortable with React Hook Forms and how it works. Here, the main part or the main purpose of this video is not how React Hook Forms actually works, but how you would actually implement a multi-step form using React Hook Forms. Nonetheless, one of the main hooks that you would use from this library is the use form hook. Is going to give you some functions and some objects back that allows you to register your fields, submit your form, watch different fields, reset your form, trigger validation, and some form state, specifically the errors where actually some field has validation errors. We're also using ZOD to validate the form, and we've installed this hook form resolvers, and we got the ZOD out of it. Like this, you can just pass in any form data schema to your React Hook Forms. So therefore, it is going to parse or validate the data submitted by the client from your form against this schema. So let's just quickly look at this schema as well. This is inside of our lib folder, a schema file. I've created this form schema. I have a first name, which is a string, last name, email. They're pretty much all of them are string. Minimum of 1 is a replacement for the non-empty value, which is deprecated. This is to just say this is a required field, and then any other field that you might have here or any other validation that you want to actually implement on top of what I had done here, you can just do it inside this schema. Now, the good thing about ZOD is you can actually use that same schema and infer a type from it. So you can use these types later on inside of your hook, whether it's this use form hook or for your submit handler function, you can use the same type. So you infer the types from the same schema. There's no need to duplicate types from your data schema. Now, this process form is a function that we're going to then pass to this handle submit function. So the way it works is on your form, if I scroll down to our form here, we have this handle on submit event listener, which calls this handle submit. This is the function that's returned back to you from the use form. And then you would send this callback. This is your own callback. I called it process form to it. You can call it whatever you want, which receives the data submitted from the form and then does whatever it needs to do. Here, I'm just logging the data and then reset the form. This is where you would call an external API, your own API, or maybe use server actions to actually directly do something on your server side in your database and then respond to the client side. Now, as you can see, I've updated this next function. This is the function that was supposed to just increment the step to the next step if there was any other step. As you can see, there are more stuff added to it. But before we dive into what we're doing here, let me just explain what the idea was behind my implementation. So on the first step, when the user wants to actually click on the next button, I want to validate these 3 fields that are in step 1. How did I go about doing that? Well, first of all, in our steps array up top, I've added all the fields that are going to be inside of this step. That's the first thing that I did. Now, inside of this next button that's going to call this next function on click, I'm getting all the fields from that specific step. So I'm step at the current step and I'm getting a field. This is just literally going to return this array of different steps. Now, use form hook actually exposes a function called trigger. This is going to trigger validation. You can use it by just calling the function alone without passing any parameters. That's going to validate all the fields. If you want to validate a specific or a single field, you can just pass a string. Or if you want to validate multiple fields, you can pass an array of strings, and that's what I'm doing here. So I'm passing in the fields that belongs to that specific step. And then I'm passing this shoot focus. This is a way for the cursor to actually come back, focus on the field that has the error. If it makes sense, you can add it. If not, you can just pass the array of the fields. And what this does is that it returns a promise. And this is going to be true if there is no errors. And it's going to be false if it encounters any validation error. So on this next button, if there is any errors, I'm going to return, meaning that I'm not going to the next step. And if it is true, meaning that they actually have inputted the correct information here, what's going to happen is that, again, we're going to check to see if there is actually any other step. And then we're going to go to the next step. Now here inside of this if, I'm checking to see if I am the second to the last step. So my last step is going to be the completion. That's not the step that I want to actually navigate to. That's where I actually want to submit my form, process the form, talk to my API. And if this is successful, I want to actually go to that third or finish final completion step. And this is this second if check, what this is doing. Okay, so all we had done to our next function is to validate the fields in each step once the user clicks on this button. Now, the previous step is the same because once you have moved to the next step, you can go back to the previous step because you've already validated this step. So you can go back, but anytime that you want to go to the next step, you have to have completed that step that you're currently on, and we have to validate that. Now down here on the form, just to quickly review how we would register each field in React Hook Forms is that we're going to use this register function. We're going to pass the name attribute of the field. This is the first name, so I'm spreading over the props returned from this register. And also I'm including this error object. So for the errors, if you remember out of the use hook form, we got this errors object from the form state. This is going to include a property for each of our fields. So for example, for the first name, there's going to be a property called first name on it. And if there's any errors, there's going to be a message on it. So if there is any message, if there is any error, I'm just going to show it here. So as easy as that, I am just registering every field and showing an error just underneath every field. And that's all we had done to hook our form with React Hook Forms. So now if I move to the second step and actually fill in an address here, I'm going to the last page. If I now inspect the console, because I'm just logging the result, you can see I have all of my fields from the first name, last name, state, and street to the city. So all the fields from both steps actually logged here. And this is actually the function called inside of the next. If you remember here, we check to see when the next button is clicked, if we are actually to the second last step here. What I've done is that I am actually calling this same handle submit function that we get back from the use form, and I'm passing the process form function that I have to it. This is going to return a function, and I'm just invoking that. This is going to receive the states or the data from the form, and then we're going to process it. Right now, I'm just, as I mentioned, logging them to console. This is again where you talk to your database, call your API endpoints and whatnot. Now, that's all there is to it to implement a multi-step form using React Hook form to control the states and to also trigger validation when the user is trying to navigate between different steps. We use ZOD here. You can use different schema validation tools, but the concept and the logic is going to be the same. Now, in the last step, we can add some animation to make our form look nicer by bringing in framer motion. Okay, so I've gone ahead and added framer motion, and the idea is going down to each of our steps. Let me just close this off. So for our form inside of each of our steps now, instead of rendering that div, we want to render motion.div. If you haven't used framer motion, it's pretty easy to animate different elements using framer motion. You just get this motion from the package, and you can turn any of your HTML elements like a div to a motion.div, and that allows you to pass in extra attributes like initial state and animate state and transitions. So therefore, framer motion can actually animate your element from your initial state to the animate state with the transition that you define there. So let's start by the animation that we're doing on each of these div elements that are literally wrapping our step. Okay, so what I'm doing is that I'm starting from an X. This is going to be your translate X. So it's going to move the component over on the X axis and opacity of 0. And then I'm going to X0 and then opacity of 1. So the element or the page or the step is going to move from right to left to then come to where it's supposed to be at X of 0. Now, before I explain what exactly I'm doing here with this delta, let me just close this off and go to our second step where we're actually doing the exact same thing. We're having the same transition or translate X from opacity of 0 to opacity of 1 with a transition that allows me to set a duration and an ease function. Okay, now to show you how this would behave if I only had one specific number here. So let's say I'm passing in 200. This is going to be 200 pixels. And then I'm going to have 200 over here, which means each step is going to move from translate X of 200 off the screen to the 0. So now if I refresh the page, you can see the step moved inside. If I now complete this step and go to the next one, an email, so it moves correctly. But then now watch what happens when I go back. When I go back now, again, it goes from right to left, which doesn't make sense. You would want this to have the opposite direction of translate X when you're going back, and the regular one when you're going forward. So basically, it has to be reverse of each other if you're going back and if you're going forward. Now, let me bring in that delta value back and actually show you what happens when we have this delta. Basically, it's just flipping the negative or the direction of this translate X. So from one way, it comes from the right hand side. And if you go back, it comes from the left hand side to actually mimic the behavior of you flipping through these pages. So now if I put in a name and also an email, if I go to the next step, we're going to see it navigate from the right. But if I go back, the previous page actually slides in from the left, which is more natural than having just the same type of animation, whether or not you're going back and forth. So what is this delta? It's basically the difference between the current page and the previous page. So I've added a new state, which is the previous page, and then a current step or the previous step and the current step. And then my delta is the current step minus the previous step. If it's positive, I'm moving further or I'm going next. If it is negative, I'm actually moving back. Now down here inside of my next function and previous function, anytime that I want to set the current step, I actually set the actual or the current step to the previous step before changing this state. So therefore, I'm always holding the value of my current step as the previous step while I'm changing to the next step. So I can always calculate the delta or the direction of where we're moving. If you're going ahead, so I can translate from the right. And if I'm going back, I can translate from the back. So this is the only part or the tricky part for adding this animation to our different pages to actually change the direction of our translate X. Other than that, using framer motion and turning your divs into motion, that divs or any other element really to animate them, it's pretty simple. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We implemented a multi-step form in React or Next.js using the React hook forms for controlling our form state, ZOD to validate each input on every step, and then framer motion to actually animate between different steps. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.